I'm Councilman Dale Gorczynski. Access Houston Cable Television is Houston's newest source for quality local programming. Educational programs, community access programs, the local arts, all this and more is now available. Tune in to Access Houston on your cable system. Check the newspapers for programs and times. It's television for all of us.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Bradmark Investments Presents All Around Houston. I'm your host, Reuben Sherman. But before we get into this week's show, I'd like to mention that due to the response we had about last week's show, Benjamin Art Galleries presents, they are holding an art seminar on art as an investment. For more information, you should contact Mr. Chuck Girard or Miss Kathy Behrens at 621-2808. But this week, my guest is Mr. Bob Lanier, former commissioner for the Texas Highways here in the state of Texas under Governor Mark White, and most recently chairman of the Citizens for Mobility, chiefly responsible for the Metro election. Welcome to All Around Houston.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking you, to what do you directly attribute the success of the Metro election?
Well, I think fundamentally it was a good plan. We were addressing mobility, and I think this was a balanced plan. I think it was a good plan, and I think the voters saw it as such. I think that's the first most important thing. And I'd say the second thing is that a broad-based consensus came together behind the plan. The Chamber of Commerce, the Economic Development Council, TMO, the minority community, elected representatives. And so the whole town came together behind the program.
Now you said an interesting point there, and if you don't mind, I'll pause and elaborate on that just a bit. You said the minority community.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were certain forces in the minority community who had some adverse sort of things to say about whether or not this was a good, solid plan. Do you have any figures or any notion of how you did in those particular districts or particular areas where there was strong opposition?
Well, overall, I think we won the vote in the minority community about 65-35. And in the main, I think the elected representatives of that area were in favor of the program. Now, in an election, you don't get all the votes and you don't get all the supporters. Ron Wilson, Representative Ron Wilson, came out against the plan, but in his particular district, we carried that 2-1.
That's interesting. Very, very interesting. So you don't think it had his opposing that didn't have much effect at all, I assume? Or?
Vigorous cross-examination forces me to admit that.
Very, very good. Listen, let me ask you.
I crumble under the onslaught.
What's the next step following this great election? By the way, I'm sure that everyone really pat you on the back now and congratulates you on being successful. It's something that very many people said for some time would not have done that well.
Well, thank you, but putting that congratulations element first, I don't look on this as personal at all. I really think the significant thing, if it were, I don't think it'd be that significant. I think the significant thing is that the whole community really came together and did something as a community that was important to the community. In terms of what happens next, I'd say what happens next would be the implementing of the plan. It's broken down into several sections. We voted 25% of the sales tax for street and road improvement. And I think that work just ought to get right underway. They'll be hiring engineers and clearing right-of-way and doing road projects all over the city. That $560 million, it looks like it'll be matched by the State Highway Department, and so we'll be going to Austin to try to get it.
You say looks like it will be matched.
Yes.
Does that mean that it isn't something that's already set in stone? Or
no, the matching is not set in stone. Hopefully it'll be set in concrete. The Highway Commission last month voted that it was essential to the Commission to match transit funds for road and street work, and they directed staff to come back with a specific program to allow that implementation, to allow that matching to occur. But that'll probably be another 2 or 3 months working its way through the system. But I'd say the first thing would be the street and road construction. We have money to replace and supplement the bus fleet. That'll be proceeding. We're to complete the transit ways. That'll be proceeding. Probably the last element to get underway will be the rail component. And that was voted conditioned on getting 70% of the money from some mix of the private sector and the federal government. And I'd say the next step there will be to try to crystallize that private commitment. And it'll be for the directors to go to Washington and try to get the federal commitment.
So there will be some lobbying that will need to take place in Washington to,
yes, and really
sort of help this plan along.
Yes, and that's really an ongoing thing, ongoing nature. There'll be lobbying in connection with getting extra state and federal funds for Houston in connection with the Metro program. There will and should be lobbying that will go on from now on. And it'll be a matter, again, where you'll need to develop a consistent, ongoing community consensus. Our congressional representatives can help in Washington. Our state representatives can help in Austin. In both cases, it really helps if both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, are together, and they were in this election.
These people that you're now relying on to help lobby in Washington, were they on board originally, or did they catch the late train, as they say in politics?
Oh, I think I'd give everybody that got on this one credit for an early train. As a matter of fact, I'd say the door's still open. And you know, the few that opposed it, I don't hold any feeling there, and my hope is next time around they'll support us. Ron Wilson, I mentioned him, but he's a nice fella, and I see no reason why in future chores or funding in Austin that he wouldn't and couldn't be helpful. You can't afford to get mad at somebody just because they oppose you in the election, because you're going to lose some people that were for you this time.
A lot of people were saying, Mr. Lanier, that we should have sort of held back, that these are tough economic times, that in fact this isn't the time to try and spend more, but to save more. How would a person in your position, knowing the current economic situation of Houston, respond to something like that?
Well, I think that's incorrect. I think that it's a question, first of all, of whether you have confidence in the city or whether you don't. I think if the town's not going to grow any, if it's going to sit here, and if it's not even going to recover the ground it lost, then I think that argument's valid. But if this town does have a bright future, and I think it does, if all the factors are in place that made it a great city are still in place and will let it grow in the future, then I think that now is the classic time to treat the infrastructure questions. For example, construction costs are much lower now than they would be during boom times. And traditional economics holds that you do your infrastructure work, your streets and your roads and your rail, if you will, and things of that nature, you do them during the downturn for two reasons. First of all, well, three reasons really. First of all, it cushions the downturn. It gives jobs during the time when people badly need them.
How many jobs are going to directly
3,000, roughly 3,600. And second, it tends to make the area more attractive and to hasten the time in which the upturn will occur.
And there was a third reason you gave.
Well, it slipped my mind.
Okay. There were a lot of people who told me that other parts of the country were looking at the city of Houston to see if we would in fact pass this referendum, to see if we would in fact be supportive, if we'd come together. Was it your experience that other states, other cities, and in fact other powers that be around the country were watching this to see if in fact the city of Houston would come together to pass this, and if in fact it would be a sign that Houston is on the uprise again?
Yes, I got calls from the Los Angeles newspaper, from the Atlanta Constitution, from people in Dallas, San Antonio, Austin. People were watching this from several points of view, one of which was to see whether Houston would move forward, whether Houston could come to an agreement to meet its mobility problems. And then the particular nature of this plan caused people in other jurisdictions to watch it. This was a transit agency moving beyond treating pure transit and moving to a more global responsibility for moving people. The street and road program is part of that. And other agencies around the state and indeed around the nation were watching to see if this trend or this position would be attractive to the voters.
Have you been contacted since
Yes,
the election?
yes,
and
yes.
what were the responses, just out of curiosity?
Interested, probably wanting to adopt similar plans. The Texas Highway Commission said that this ought to serve as a model plan. People in different cities were wanting to see exactly why this agency got the favorable vote that it got, that if roads were a big part of the reason, they might want to put road improvement in their own transit plan. If not having a debt was a good reason, they were trying to see if they could tinker their plan around and match and handle their transit problem without debt. They were looking and seeing what features of the plan would be adaptable to their particular city.
To their particular cities.
Yes.
You mentioned the 3,000, I think you said 700 jobs.
600, yes.
600 jobs that would directly result from this. What, more specifically, is the direct economic impact on the city of Houston by virtue of the passage of this referendum?
Sure. Well, the 3,600 jobs those are direct jobs. Those do not include indirect jobs. If you look at the aggregate employment treating the mobility question in Houston, and that's the highway department, major thoroughfares, and transit, that number will probably reach 20 to 25,000 jobs. And this is part of that overall program, and moving this is essential to the health of the overall $20,000 to $25,000 program. That's in terms of jobs. But there are other very broad, significant points. The first is that back in '83, the Houston Chamber said that we had a $2 billion a year surcharge on the Houston economy due to unreasonable congestion. That is, the city, the taxpayers here were paying in terms of time lost, time wasted, an extra $2 billion a year because we didn't have enough lanes to move our traffic, that we didn't have an adequate transit system, that we didn't have an adequate highway system. This is an essential part of treating that problem. And to put how much $2 billion a year, to put that in perspective as to how much that is, the Pennzoil-Texaco settlement, biggest in the history of this country, $3 billion. What that means is we were spending a Pennzoil-Texaco settlement every 18 months in terms of congestion cost. What that meant to us as a city is that we were being scratched off the short list of industries seeking to relocate. They didn't want to put their employees into that situation. They didn't want to put their movement of freight in that situation. And Governor Clement's year 2000 study had called it a cancerous growth on Houston's economic future. And the other thing about treating your mobility problems is it opens up the way to attract a new industry. In San Antonio, for example, the highway, we recently opened a new freeway there. Mm-hmm. And as we did, SeaWorld opened on it. And opening that freeway was essential to SeaWorld moving in, some 1,500 employees. A Union Carbide plant located alongside. If you move down the street to Galveston, the highway department gave them some essential help that let them locate to the home port, let the home port locate there. And what you'll find is you treat your mobility problem, in addition to solving the congestion problem, removing that congestion tax, in addition to direct employment, 20 to 25,000 in the aggregate, some 3,600 on transit. You'll have specific opportunities to do specific transportation things that'll bring specific industry to the city. And I expect that to happen.
That's fantastic. Let me put a comma there, and we'll take a break and be right back to talk more specifically about what this referendum means to the city of Houston after this.
This small packet that I have in my hand is a gift of life. It saved the lives of 1.5 million children last year. It's nothing complicated, simply salt and sugar to be added to clean water. It costs about 10 cents and is being identified as a cure for dehydration caused by diarrhea, which is the single biggest killer of children worldwide. This is part of a revolution in child health care launched by UNICEF.
I'm talking with Mr. Bob Lanier, chairman of the Citizens for Mobility, chiefly responsible for the passage of the recent Metro referendum. Let's address just for a second the future transit problems that the city of Houston might possibly face, and how you see this plan that the voters recently so overwhelmingly supported will help alleviate that problem.
Sure, I see urban mobility as a three-legged stool. You have the highway department treating highways that handles through traffic. You have major thoroughfares, which handles local traffic. Major thoroughfares are normally tended to by the city and the county. And the third leg of the stool is transit, for the transit dependent and for work trips. Some 13% of the population normally does not have automobiles. So transit is for the transit dependent and for work trips to congested areas. This particular plan undertakes to treat two of those three legs. It completes the transit system, and it makes a substantial contribution to the major thoroughfare program.
When you say completes the transit system, what do you mean completes the transit system?
All right. To lay a little predicate for that, each one of these three legs needs to be a complete system within itself. That is to say, needs to cover the entire community. The highway system needs to for through traffic. It needs to move through traffic east, west, north, south, so forth. The major thoroughfares need to be the major connectors in between these freeways. And the transit system needs to be a complete system in that it covers the entire community. This system does that. It's one of the few in North America that does it. Probably the only one commenced in modern times that does it. And it does it by virtue of the fact that we're bringing transitways in each major freeway into about 610 near downtown. Then this rail loop will be the loop at the end of these radials that connects them all. So completed, we'll have a complete transit system, north, south, east, west, a complete loop serving the major employment centers, and so the entire community will be covered. And I might say this, that since 1983, Houston has really been addressing its urban mobility problem, been spending between all the agencies about $1 billion a year treating it. Is about 4 years into about a $15 or $16 billion solution to our urban mobility problem. And in my judgment, that aggregate plan, highways, major thoroughfares, and transit is the finest in this nation. And I think we're in a process of turning what used to be a liability into an asset in selling our city. Because I think we're really there now. We need to probably further the image of it a little bit. We need to keep on a little bit. But we really can say to an industry wanting to locate, hey, you really can get around in Houston better than you can in New Orleans. You really can get around in Houston better than you can in Dallas. You can get around a heck of a lot better than you can in New York City. If not, try those streets. And not only that, this is just the beginning. We're 4 years into it. We're banging 11 years on down the line. And this transit component is an essential part of that program.
Is that something that's really important to
Absolutely vital.
Businesses considering moving to
No
Houston?
question, absolutely vital. In other words, if you are sitting with unreasonable congestion, you don't make the short list. I'm a member of the Houston Economic Development Council. They tell me the very first question that industry seeking to come to Houston ask is, what's Houston doing about their congestion problem? The reason they ask that is not that we don't have the work going on now, but the national data is primarily census data, which closed in 1980, and to some extent, some really important transit studies, but the latest of those is in 1983. Well, we really just started our correction work in 1984, latter part of 83 and 84. So the national data doesn't yet reflect what we're doing. And that's a number one barrier. That's a number one question that they ask when they come in here. There's some others. That's not the only question. But it's a question which if you cannot answer satisfactorily, they don't get to the second question.
I understand. How do you then answer the hurdles that the critics have put before you throughout the entire series of this election?
As kindly as possible.
They constantly,
well,
and in fact, are getting signatures.
Well, I don't mind
that.
I don't mind that. It's a democratic process, and the democratic process is not neat. It's not orderly. People have free debate. I think that's a wonderful thing. I think the result of it was that the anti-side got showed to the voters. I think the pro-side got showed to the voters, and I think the voters made their choice. And I think that process will continue, and I think it's healthy. I think if they can persuade the voters that Metro has a bad plan and they vote it down, chances are Metro does have a bad plan. They ought to vote it down. But I'm entirely comfortable with the process. I'm entirely comfortable with submitting the case to the voters. I think in '83 they turned it down because the plan was flawed. I think.
How?
Well, I think it was flawed because it didn't have a complete rail system, that's one thing. It had a rail segment. It just served the southwest end of town, then would have been out of money.
Now that's interesting because if I read correctly, you were against rail. or are against rail, and you might,
Well, I certainly wouldn't describe myself as a rail enthusiast, and I've been able to restrain my exuberance for it on numerous occasions. But it's not so much that I'm against rail per se. What I'm interested in is the aggregate mobility problem. And I'm interested in allocating resources so that we end up moving all our people in all our systems. And the problem with rail, in many instances, is not the train itself. They can make pretty trains, they go fast, people like to ride them. That's not the problem. The problems are several that I've seen. One is they cost too much. Costing too much was treated in this plan by the fact that the federal government's going to pay 70% of the money. The local taxpayers, 30%. At 30 cents on the dollar, I think it's a bargain. At 100 cents on the dollar, I think it'd cost too much. Be like comparing it to a Cadillac. You might not want to buy one for $25,000, but if you get it for $7,500, it might be a bargain. Now, the next objection I've had to rail has been, like the 83 plan, it was one segment, and you're out of money. This plan covers the entire community. It's not one segment, it is a completed system, so that objection is met. My third objection has been, many times to get rail and to get the cost down, people come in and simply build a streetcar system. Everything at grade, going along, stopping at red lights, bumping in traffic. I don't think that helps anything. I think it's a joke. We avoided that. We are grade separated at major intersections. We're coming underground downtown to connect to the pedestrian system. And then and I don't know if I've mentioned or not, but the idea of having a complete system and not just a segment.
At what point in the plan will the rail come into effect?
It'll probably be the last. It'll probably be the last thing to be built, because we have to first get the commitment from Congress to fund their, along with the private sector, to fund their 70%. Then after that, we have to draw plans and specifications.
Now, your opponents said that rail was never mentioned on the ballot. And
Yes.
for, I guess, a lot of our viewers, that because it plays such a significant factor in this, was a valid point. How would you answer that?
They called me and made me that valid point, and I told them if they could find one person in Houston, Texas that did not know the rail component was in there and give me that person's name and telephone number, I would personally call them and tell them.
Perhaps they're out there.
Yes. I think the media adequately covered that. My view would be more than adequate.
Right.
What I really hated was the plan was very balanced, I thought. It had more money spent for roads, local money, than spent for rail. I think rail got featured in the main, in the media, in the unpaid media, because it was the most interesting. It was where there was a controversy. Some people thought rail was a bad idea, some good. And so you go quote Henry that said it was a wonderful idea, and Joe said it was dumb, and that made an interesting story. So I think rail got disproportionately mentioned in the free media because it was interesting. We had one TV spot, it ran 30 seconds. And they hopped on us because we didn't mention rail as much as they would have liked, although we did mention it in that 30 seconds.
You say you had one TV spot.
Yeah,
What was your general strategy?
It was a turnout election. We thought when we did our poll, it looked to us like that the public thought it was a good plan, and the public was going to vote for it. We thought we had to, what we had to guard against was a distorted turnout. So we spent a lot of time and effort getting in touch with the people who were our supporters and trying to increase the likelihood that they would get to the polls. The second thing was that in our polls, it showed that while that most of the people were for it, it showed a big batch of undecideds, but it showed that when you went in and talked to those undecideds, that they tended to come over and decide over in favor of the plan. So the second part of it was we had speakers bureaus, and we went to civic club after civic club. We went to all kinds of different organizations and made the case to them, and they seemed to come in for it. The Chamber did, the Economic Development Council did, the TMO did, different minority organizations, different civic groups, City Post Oak, different trade associations.
So you think you did a pretty good job then in reaching the undecideds, and do you think that was a major factor in
I think the group that worked on it did a wonderful job.
But it was your group, though.
Yeah, I was in the group.
Chairman, I would say you were in the group.
Well, I'm just saying, don't call me madam. I was just one of the girls. No, I think the campaign was as well run as any I've been in.
Mm-hmm.
I think it had a job to do, and that job was to inform. And then after informing was to try to get our vote to the polls, and I think that's what happened. See, we started off this way. We knew that there was almost 30% of the electorate that was going to vote against any plan that included rail. The problem was there was about 20-odd% that would have voted against any plan that didn't include rail, okay?
Yeah.
Well, ours included the rail component. So that meant there was about 70% of the votes out there up for grabs. We were going to lose 30 going in. Well, we got about 60 of that 70. And that's, I think that was about as good as could have been done.
I've heard rumors, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard rumors that you're being strongly considered to chair Metro. How do you respond to that?
Well, I've not been asked, and I've not sought it. And since I haven't been asked and haven't sought it, I haven't really decided what I would do if I am asked. Mm-hmm. I got off the Highway Commission, which I really enjoyed. I served 4.5 years there because I needed some time to tend to my business.
Sure.
And I wouldn't say that my business is wonderful yet. And so it wouldn't hurt me to work at it a little longer, although I really have enjoyed public service. I really have. Far more, I've really enjoyed public service, I found out, much more than business. I've just been doing it the last 5 years or so, but it's been very, very fulfilling to me.
So if given the opportunity, I assume that you would...
No, that's I wouldn't assume that. I would, if I were asked, I would think about it. I would go talk to people who've served in that job before, kind of ask them what their experiences were as they saw my strengths and shortcomings, how I would fit into that, ask them how much time it took, and my nature is such, I'd go about that in a very systematic manner, and then I would decide. And I really couldn't say how I would decide now. And like I say, it's about like asking a girl if she would go with Henry at the dance, and Henry ain't called her yet.
But I don't know, being in a position where you had some reservations about rail, and I'd like to spend a second on that, because a lot of people, back to the whole rail issue and the whole rail question, because it is so important, and it was such a factor in the election. A lot of people, when you talk about the difference between a light rail system and a heavy rail system, don't know the difference.
Well, I'm not sure anybody does. It's an expression that started off meaningful, and those meanings have really been blurred. Light rail isn't any lighter than heavy rail. It doesn't cost any less. Mm-hmm. There's a popular misconception that light rail costs a lot less than heavy rail. That's not true. The rail cost depends on whether it's a grade, that's one number, grade separated, that averages costing, say, $50 million a mile, or tunnel, that cost about $100 million a mile. At grade might be 20, 25, 30, depending on what you do. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference in terms of and if I were to show you two systems, you'd have different systems end up being called light rail or heavy rail, but conceptually and for analytical purposes, I don't know if there's all that much difference. Incidentally, they haven't really decided on the modality for sure. It's just be a fixed guideway, and one of the things to be considered, and I really think it ought to be considered seriously, is monorail. One of the reasons we're supposed to be doing rail is for a 21st century image that we present to the public, that we present to outsiders.
For business.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure why it's glamorous. About the only difference there is it runs on one track instead of two, but people seem to think that's wonderful, so maybe you take advantage of that. I think monorail ought to be seriously considered, and I think it will be. Judge Lindsay was a real proponent of keeping monorail in the consideration spectrum.
And if you do become the head of Metro, would you opt for that kind of option?
Oh no, I wouldn't prejudge it. I would simply look at the different. Possibilities. I think there what we'd probably do would be to have maybe 4 different groups come in with 4 different designs and 4 different propositions from the private sector, and then make a choice. I would say this, that although I'm not a rail enthusiast, and we agreed on rail to make this plan fly. We agreed on rail to get a community consensus. And I think what different ones of us may have thought at an earlier date is, to the extent we're involved formally with the agency, is not a factor. I think anybody running that agency ought to really break his rear to try to get the rail done. I think the worst thing you could do would be to break faith with the rail people who really made concessions to get the rail component in there and who strongly believe in it. The worst thing you could do is break faith with them and not really make a real effort to make that
We're
happen.
almost out of time. One last quick question. I understand you are a rose fanatic, and in fact, you donated roses to the city of Houston. Is that true?
Well, I don't know that I'm a fanatic, but I do like roses, yeah.
Very good. Mr. Lanier, I'd like to thank you for being my guest
you, sir.
this week on Breadmark Investments Presents All Around Houston, and you, the viewer. Until next week, good evening.